Muy buenas tardes. Antes de comenzar esta segunda sesión, quisiera preguntar si alguien en el público no tiene equipo para la traducción simultánea. Por favor, las personas encargadas suministrenselos si son tan amables a quienes no lo tengan. Gracias. Bueno, esta es la segunda sesión de la libertad de vuelta en la sede del Colegio Nacional. Encuentro realizado por la revista Letras Libres y el Centro Arte y Cultura del Centro Salinas Pliego. Esta tarde tenemos el tema es el malestar en las sociedades liberales. Participan Jan Boruma, que como dije ayer es un escritor brillante de amplio espectro, que ha escrito libros, muchos de ellos traducidos al español, sobre distintas zonas del planeta, momentos de crisis, de cambio cultural, una pluma significativa. Iván Krauze, que ya tuvimos la oportunidad de escuchar, que es una presencia importante en los foros liberales de Europa, sobre todo. Mark Lila, parte de su obra está traducida al español, la historia del pensamiento historias del pensamiento reaccionario, así como las aventuras de los intelectuales en el extremismo político. Lion Wieseltier, editor de Liberties y autor del magnífico libro autobiográfico Kadich. Va a moderar Enrique Krauze, historiador, miembro del Colegio Nacional y director de la revista Letras Libres. Enrique, por favor.
I will pose my questions in English because I think this works better, and you have we have the privilege of having a truly excellent professional team of translators. Tenemos un excelente grupo de traductores, así que espero que todos ustedes, para poder seguir esta conversación, tengan los aparatos. I wish to organize this discussion first posing to all of you one general question, which is very broad. And then I would like to focus on what you have done and written, because we have here, I couldn't imagine a more distinguished elenco, we say in Spanish, group of people that have written books and have devoted their lives to serious intellectual endeavors. So I will ask him to talk about the subjects they have been thinking and writing for so many years. And the general question is the question that is in the title of this panel. The malaise, el malestar, the principal causes of what's happening with the core problem of liberalism in our world. Are the main causes economical, technological, cultural, religious? This is the general question. I'll go from Mark to my left.
All right. Well, before I say what is a direct answer to what Enrique has asked, I want to preface my remarks by emphasizing something that Ivan said in the previous session when he spoke about state failure in the present and the difficulties all states now are having in managing their economies, especially in relation to the drama, the psychodrama of the United States. And so I think it would be helpful if we could manage to distinguish people's dissatisfactions with the present order between state failure as such, on the one hand, and on the other, a failure of something that's particular to liberalism, right? And so we don't confuse those two. Because one thing I've noticed at the conference, and it's something that is common among us, is to be a liberal is often to be a self-flagellating liberal. And if people are not happy with liberalism, we ask ourselves, well, how has liberalism failed them? How are we not meeting their expectations? And today I'd like to turn that question around and simply ask, what's wrong with these people? Not what's wrong with liberalism, but what is wrong with these general populations of people who are turning their backs on this system? Some of you may know that back in the 1950s, at some point, there was a strike and a worker rebellion in East Germany that was put down violently by the government. And it was an example of a socialist government coming down and breaking a union. And the German playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht wrote a famous poem that ended by saying that the government perhaps ought to consider firing the people and finding a new one. And I have to say that I've shared that sentiment a lot in these, especially this past decade, as I've watched what's happened in the United States, what's happened in other countries that have been touched by populism, by the rise of reactionary passions and streams of thought and streams of screaming that seem to have come from out of the gutter all of a sudden, and many of them with echoes of the past. And so the question I want to think about is, why are we not producing liberals anymore? Or why less and less are we producing people who share the values of liberalism, understand what it is to be a citizen, have the virtues and habits and expectations that are necessary for a liberal political order? Something, it seems to me, has broken. And part of it may be actually something quite proximate. Yvonne and some others were talking about the effect of COVID at the last session, and I think that certainly could have heightened a lot of the things that I'm concerned about. But certainly I cannot help but feeling that this is a machine to unmake liberal citizens. That the kind of deliberation, a liberal order depends not just on expressing an opinion, voting for people, and having them institute a program. It's also a system of deliberation about what the public good is. And you can only have a deliberative system if you have people who recognize the value of it and are capable of doing that. But so many of the forces in our economies, in our culture, in our technology, in our popular culture, do the opposite of reinforcing these sorts of virtues. And, I think there was a period after World War II where there was a sense out of that common experience, certainly in many Western countries, that the war had taught why we need liberalism, and then we had liberal orders, and then those liberal states taught their citizens to be liberals, and there was civic education and so on. And now the link has been broken, and I don't know how one starts again to create liberal citizens, and I'm not confident that we'll be able to, given the sort of technological and economic world that we live in. So it's been my job here to be the most pessimistic person in the room, and so I want to leave you with that thought of what I'm thinking about. but I'm very much in the mood to blame the victim here and to not take as seriously as perhaps we have been the criticisms of liberalism, and to stand, as Leon Wieseltier was saying in our first session yesterday, to stand by our achievements and to be proud of them and not to have to apologize for them, and to find some other understanding of what's gone on, what has gone on as people have floated away from the liberal order.
Leon, what is your answers or your provisional answers of this very broad question?
I think that the opposition to liberalism, the fear of liberalism, the post-liberal moment, and post-liberal thinkers, all of this is premised on a fundamentally flawed assumption, which is that a political worldview will answer all your needs. Liberalism was not designed to provide spiritual satisfaction. It was not designed to provide religious or philosophical or psychological satisfaction. Liberalism is not a totalistic worldview. In fact, it's an anti-totalistic worldview. And I think that the totalism, it's not, people we've talked and written about the totalitarian temptation, it's the totalistic temptation that worries me. It's the idea that people expect too much from political frameworks, and they put too much of a burden on politics. One of the things that liberals and conservatives used to agree on for decades was on the principle of the limits of the political. Both camps agreed on this. From Mill to Oakeshott, everybody understood that politics is that all of life is not political. However, the temptation to absorb all of life into politics, or conversely, the insistence that your government express and incarnate your deepest beliefs and values and dreams and fantasies, this is A, dangerous, and B, it is a test that liberalism is always going to fail, because liberalism is too sophisticated and wise and smarter than to pretend that any political doctrine can satisfy the entirety of human needs and aspirations. And needless to say, people's frustrations with liberalism are partly the frustrations of people who want definitive answers. One of the problems that we have, especially in the societies we live in now, which are grotesquely complex and grotesquely fast, is that they don't know how any longer to live in an inconclusive situation. It is very, very hard to live with uncertainty. It is very, very hard to have different resources for different aspects of one's being. It is very, very hard. You want the package. You want the package. And liberalism does not give you the package and does not promise you the package. It promises you fair social arrangements, orderly and decent political processes, a certain conception of the intrinsic dignity of every human being, which every authoritarian regime robs every citizen of, whether it says so or knows so or not. And that is, as far as I understand it, is more or less it. And the rest you're going to have to find in your houses of worship, and in your museums, and in your bedrooms, and in your schools, and where you find the meanings of human existence. And all of this is not to say that liberalism is shallow or procedural. I mean, there are so many caricatures and slanders about liberalism that are now loose in every land. All it says is that you will not find everything you need here. You will find a good shot at justice if you're patient. You will find political order. You will find a system that promises you respect, and respect as a political emotion is a subject really worth exploring because it's very, very rare. I mean, there's love, there's hatred, there's solidarity, but respect, that is very, very rare as a political virtue. And that's why what we're facing now, and I'm certainly with my brother Mark, I have a certain degree of healthy contempt for the anti-liberals and the post-liberals. I don't feel like, you know, that I owe them understanding, but the doctrines that they are preaching, from J.D. Vance to all the other post-liberals, they are holistic packages which provide all the answers to all the questions, and all the answers are by and large political religious, which is another part of post-liberalism that needs to be very, very strictly analyzed, is the sudden alliance of religion and politics, the sacralization of governments and parties and so on. So I just say to them, you know, if you're here, if you're looking for the key to all mysteries, then liberalism will disappoint you, and liberalism will also oppose you. It will fight you, because the politics of a single key to all the mysteries is not just philosophically and morally troublesome, it kills people eventually. People die. And so liberals have to really, well, that's what I think. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Ian.
Well, I'm sorry to say I agree with everything you said, which makes it a boring discussion, including the notion that we don't need to respect anti-liberals. On the other hand, I don't think criticism of liberalism is necessarily apologizing for the anti-liberals or a form of masochism. I'm an Isaiah Berliner. I think the strength of liberalism is precisely self-criticism. So I think that's a valid thing to do. Now, one of the problems I feel with these discussions is a linguistic one, and that we haven't quite defined what we mean by the word liberal, because in Europe, especially continental Europe, people use liberal, at least they used to use liberal in one way. The way most Americans use it is quite a different way. It also drives me crazy when I read the New York Times and I see Trump and the MAGA people described as conservatives. They're not conservatives, they're radical revolutionaries.
Or progressives described as liberals.
That's also absolutely true. So we have to clear that up. Now, I don't think that there's necessarily a basic antagonism between conservatives, in the classic sense of the word, and liberals. I think that what happened in European history and in America between the Republicans and the Democrats, certain wings anyway, is that you had liberalism in the classic European sense. People who were liberals were often they were in favor of laissez-faire economics, rather like David Frum, who believed in free trade, laissez-faire economics, but were socially relatively liberal. And then you had the liberals of the left, who could be described as social democrats of a kind, who shared many of those ideas, but were not so conservative, were not as much in favor of laissez-faire economics. They were influenced by socialism, although they may not have called themselves socialists, but they were influenced by socialism in the sense that they wanted to break on laissez-faire economics. They wanted arrangements that would strengthen unions and that sort of thing. And since World War II, or even before that, most liberal democracies, you had parties that were classic conservatives and you had parties that were left of center, and they they debated, they were often antagonistic, but they knew how to come to arrangements that were compromises that would more or less allow a country to function. Now, one of the things that I think has gone wrong since really the end of the Cold War, is that you no longer had parties that stood for the interests of the working class, who wanted to find ways to temper the harsh aspects of laissez-faire economics and so on. You had parties that moved away from that kind of thing, from class interests, towards more cultural and social programs to do with sex and gender and race and so on. And then you had the classic conservatives, who in many ways found in neoliberalism, and we've heard a very eloquent defense of neoliberalism, but one of the problems of neoliberalism since 1990 is that really the old social democrat parties and the classic conservative parties came to a consensus that they all believed in neoliberalism, whether it's whether it's Tony Blair or Clinton, both of whom rather admired Margaret Thatcher. They continued more or less in the vein that had been introduced by Reagan in the era of Reagan and Thatcher, and in many European countries became parts of the same government. Interests were no longer being sufficiently represented. People on the right who were afraid of immigration, who thought in terms of national identity, national pride, all that kind of thing, were dissatisfied as well. And this led to a tremendous resentment against what was seen as coalition governments or neoliberal parties, whether they were on the right or the left, who took care of elite interests. And this analysis is maybe unfair, but that's the way it's been seen. And so that left the road wide open to demagogues who could promise a new pride in national identity, stopping foreigners from polluting our blood, taking care of the honest working class who are true native sons and soils of the sun, of the soil, and so on. And so I think this is not a criticism of liberalism as an idea, because I entirely agree with all the things you said about the virtues of liberalism, but it is a criticism of the way that politics, and it's not a blame, because I'm not even sure it was something that could easily be avoided. I mean, Tony Blair and Clinton saw very clearly that their neoliberal position was the only way to get elected. And once they got elected, they did many good things. So it's not necessarily that they were venal or stupid or anything like that. I mean, they did what at the time seemed a sensible thing. But as we know in history, even the best intentions can have unexpected consequences that later trip us up. And I think we're now living with the consequences of many decades where political programs of traditional parties had become too watered down to appeal to enough people.
Ivan.
Yeah. In 1978, Albert Hirschman went to Paris. And he was not there for 10 years, so he was there in 1968. And he was kind of very much trying to ask himself what happened with all these revolutionaries of 1968. In 1978, most of them basically have been very much integrated in a bourgeois society that they have been fighting. And he wrote a book called Shifting Involvements, in which he said something which is relevant to our discussion. Regardless of what choice you are making, you're getting disappointed. This is how society works. So you get, for example, very much politically active, and in a decade you decide it does not work, or you get in your private life, I'm not interested in politics, and then you discovered in a decade that politics is interested in it. I'm saying this because in my view, one of the paradoxes of liberalism is that this is something that Daniel Bell claimed about capitalism, that capitalism works best with people who are produced by the old regime. For example, saving person is not the product of capitalism. The borrowing one is the product of capitalism. But capitalism was working quite well with basically pre-capitalist cultural environment, exactly because it allows to distinguish between politics, between culture, between economy, this famous book about the cultural contradictions of capitalism. I'm saying this because post-Cold War liberalism was very much nourished in the political experience of illiberal societies from before. It's very much true for Eastern Europe. For example, you can be obsessed about the freedom of media and freedom of speech only if you have been living in a society where this was not possible. And even in a certain way, I do believe that we are totally underestimating to what extent also Western liberalism was defined by who was your enemies. If there was not this kind of a major push on socialist realism, control over art, the importance of culture, I don't believe that many of these important cultural products of the Cold War, like jazz and modern art, were going to be so important for the United States. And then come the end of the Cold War, and I do believe one of the best sentences written about this was one of the characters of the John Updike novel who said, "What is the meaning of being an American if there is not a Cold War?" This was an identity crisis. In a certain way, the liberal identity of the way that we know outside of the US. I know that there is a very strong liberal tradition in the United States, but this particular type of a temperament was very much the result of this. And then you have a generation which comes and basically many of these things are taken for granted. For my generation, crossing borders was an existential experience. And this is really amazing. For a decade, any time I was crossing border by car, you have the feeling that something important is happening in your life. In the life of my daughter, honestly speaking, this is a non-event. And as a result of it, my major argument is that I do believe that liberalism should be self-critical because anything, this is how it developed. But we all the time try to see what are the successes, what are the failures. The successes and the failures are the same thing. For example, the major success of the post-communist tradition was that very peacefully you move from a regime that was highly repressive, which was very powerful, 1 million members of the Communist Party in 8 million Bulgaria in 1989, without any violence, you're going basically and building a democratic system. And this was the major success. 30 years later, younger generation is asking the question, why so easy? How it happened that suddenly, basically, everybody becomes a Democrat.
Becomes what? Sorry.
Democrats. How it happened that suddenly everybody is a Democrat. How much you can so easily reinvent yourself, totally, basically, divorced from certain type of political stories. Or people said, we were demanding justice. We got the rule of law. And this is the major story. After a certain period of time, when the fears has disappeared, when certain type of political experience is not there, you cannot understand the choices that have been made. There was a very important fear of how the communist state is going to react to the transition. And part of the price and compromise that you're doing is you're allowing the communist elites to transfer some of their political power into economic power. But this was kind of the cost of peace. 20 years later, the younger generation, they do not have the fear of the power of the Communist Party because they don't know it. And they said, why this happened? Why these people ended as one of the richest people in the country? Why they ended beneficiary of the system? And I'm saying this because this change of the perspective makes it very difficult to explain. Because in paradoxical sense, Fukuyama was right. We see the end of history because nobody is interested in history anymore. Nobody is basically trying to contextualize certain decisions. And I want to end up on this because for me this was quite important. For this generation of people, either coming from the World War II or coming from Eastern Europe or Germany after this, liberalism was about tragic choices. And Isaiah Berlin was very open on this. You're very rarely choosing between good and evil. All the time when you're making a choice, you're sacrificing something which is a value of you. Liberalism was transformed in a society which, in its simple narrative, was about a win-win situation every time. I remember it was on September 11, 2001. It was before we knew what is going to happen in New York. There was a time difference, as you know, so I was in a movie theater. And there was a movie. And there is a movie which probably you don't remember. It was called Air Force One. A famous American blockbuster movie, which was kind of a classical Greek tragedy. American president should make a choice. He can save either his country or his family. This sounds really like a classical Greek tragedy. What he did, he saved both. And this story,
and he killed, and he murdered somebody.
I do believe this type of a story that you are not going to have a tragic choices anymore, that everything is a win-win game. This is what basically makes people very resentful. And now when you're basically telling people that something is a win-win game, they don't believe. And this is why people like Trump, who comes and basically he attracts people, not with his kind of honesty now means being totally egoistic and brutal. I want it for myself. I'm going to do it. Listen, everything is about me. Give me the Nobel Prize. Give me this, give me that. And people said, he's an honest man. He's speaking what basically he thinks. And in my view, this is very important. And this is why it's so difficult to understand that by the way, this experience which we have with Trump is going to produce a new type of liberals. And I agree very much that social media is destroying the idea of a self-reflective person. You cannot be self-reflective all the time, that it is destroying different things. But this is a new experience. And this new experience is going to have a reaction on its own, and it already has. This, by the way, liberalism is not going to be the same what it was before. But this is true also for the Cold War liberalism compared to the liberalism, for example, of the beginning of the 20th century.
So before...
Enrique, I just have to say,
before
wait, one second, just one sentence, that I've never before heard a Harrison Ford movie referred to as a classical Greek tragedy.
But what was Antigona? Choosing...
Well, that, yes.
So before going into particular questions, please react freely. Please, Mark.
Yeah, to summarize grossly what Ivan was saying, or part of what he was saying, I think, is an argument once heard before that people's attachment to liberalism will depend on either them having faced or lived through some non-liberal or even more violent or repressive experience, or for people who've come from a religiously repressive society. And the question then becomes, well, once we give people affluence and freedom, and they have no memory of these other experiences, what's the attraction? Can we imagine that they will continue to be liberals? And Leon, a second ago, suggested that, well, liberalism, you see, is not a worldview, it's not a package, it's not a total. It allows you to live a certain sort of life where politics does not intervene and so on. But then you come to the question of whether, once people are given that and put in that situation, do they have the inner resources to live a meaningful life without religion, without the forced solidarity of repression? And that seems to me an open question, because we're not only liberals here, we're liberal Democrats. And what that means is that we don't typically make distinctions between classes of people. And to say something like there's a class of human being for whom liberalism is exactly what they need to live a flourishing life. In the same society, there are going to be people for whom that's not the case. And instead, they would need something else to nourish them. And then here is where the conservative arguments start to have some force, when they say that liberalism undermines these other sources of inner nourishment, spiritual nourishment, communal nourishment. And so I think we're facing a bit that situation at the present, because for a certain class of people, the kind of liberty we're talking about, the limits of politics and so on that allow us to go and fulfill ourselves and complete ourselves and all of that psychobabble, may not be the best kind of life for people who are alone, a single mother whose husband is addicted to pornography, runs off with somebody else, she's left with 2 kids, she's lonely, she comes home at night, her family itself is broken or in another part of the country. A lot of lonely lives that are there. And I'm seeing more and more of them in a kind of, Michel Houellebecqian way. And what one wonders what we can offer for people like this, and it's not going to be the same. What is good for us as a class is just not going to be sufficient.
But I don't understand why that is liberalism's problem in the following sense. I think that there have always been lonely people, and there always will be lonely people, and they need resources of a kind they may have, they may not have. I mean, the question you ask of how can everybody or ordinary people or millions of people find meaningful lives is the ultimate question of human existence. But I don't know what that has to do with liberalism. Liberalism liberalism says to them, if you want comfort or support in a church, go to a church. Liberalism does not say you can't go to a church. There are authoritarianisms that have said you can't go to a church. If you find comfort and support from popular music, from anything, go do it. Go do it. In other words, the human condition is not politics' real subject, as far as I understand it.
No, I agree, but I think there is a problem here, which is a sort of tragic paradox of liberalism, which is that, Tocqueville, I think, pointed out that American democracy worked precisely because so many Americans were devout Christians, because that took care of that particular problem. And our generation, I think I can speak for at least some of it, of the sort of late 60s, early 70s, we were very much...
Late 70s.
Early 70s in my case, for very liberal reasons, we're very much against the power of organized religion. Do your own thing was considered to be a great virtue. Organized, certainly in the country I grew up in, organized religion was still very strong when I was a child. You couldn't switch the radio on Sundays without hearing endless people preaching at you. But people, that was very much part of people's identity. But if you were part of the educated, privileged, urban elite class, you were against all those things. Hang on, let me finish. So you wanted complete freedom. You wanted those organized institutions to stop. And we're now faced in some ways, again, with the unintended consequences. Partly what we're seeing now is also a reaction, I think, against a certain aspect of the 1960s. And so we now find a society where all the things we were in favor of, or indeed against, in the 1960s have come to pass. People don't go to church as much as they used to, certainly not in Europe. The old institutions that told people more or less what to think or took care of their spiritual needs have collapsed. Now, Mark is quite right that has left a vacuum. But since we are liberals, and since I agree with you, we can't really honestly say in good faith, well, I'm in favor of people going back to the church, and I think churches should be strengthened again, and religion should have a bigger role in society. We can't really say that if we don't feel that about ourselves.
But I don't see why not. I have been all my life a religious man and all my life a liberal. I have never for a moment experienced that as a contradiction.
Well, speak for yourself.
No, hold on. That is, to put it mildly, anecdotal. But while we were busy finding freedoms and rejecting things, one of the things we didn't notice is that there was a whole country out there that was not doing that. The church did not die, God did not die. All kinds of important social and civic and religious institutions continued to survive. They were not all repressive or organs of the state. I mean, you know, so if the question is going to be, where should people find meaning in life? That's a perfectly valid question. But I need to know what it has to do with who's running for president.
Yeah, but I think maybe the history of the United States is somewhat different from Europe. Europe really has, Western Europe certainly, and Eastern Europe too, has secularized
that's right.
far more than the United States.
That's true.
And again, I think Marx's diagnosis is right. There is, people clearly feel a lack of this, but as a liberal who has never been religious, it's not for me to start saying that or advocating for the revival of religious institutions.
But on this, there is interesting statistics about the United States, because normally you talk about the liberal elites that have certain way of life, which was resented by the population as a whole. If you see the number of divorces in the United States, it's much higher with people with a low education. In a certain way, ordinary Americans started living like the American elite in the 1970s. And then suddenly, basically, the liberal elite started not to like it. By the way, even on the level of how many children do you have, on the level even of a church going, you have this reverse trend. Mm-hmm. So before, the idea was that you have a traditional population that believes in God and so on, and you have the liberal elites. And the problem was that this population was not following you. And suddenly they following you, but you decided to change. And for me, the problem is with individualism, and here it has a lot to do with how capitalism was changed in this kind of a social media story. Because individualism before was, I'm fighting for the fact to tell you that I'm different, I have my own opinion, I have much more interest, and nobody can speak on behalf of me. I know best what is best for me. Even the most smartest person in the world cannot say this. And then the market said, exactly. I'm going to come to you, and every day I'm going to give you what you really want, and nothing else. And I'm going to get, if I'm going to order a book, the next day I'm going to get a similar book being recommended to me by Amazon, if I'm going to ask for something else. So suddenly we start to see our own individualism being weaponized around us, against us. This type of a loneliness that you talk about is that it became so difficult. And even the idea of choice, which was so important of liberalism, I have choice. And now we have so much choices that you have the tyranny of it. I'm always giving the example with some fashion shops practices. I have a 24-year daughter. This is all my knowledge of the world comes from, working at her. So she's buying a dress. The moment she's buying, she does not like it anymore. And she's going to return it. And the shop is going to be happy with this. And in a certain way, she's choosing all the time, but none of the choices is final. When I'm buying a jacket, I'm going to like it because I'm not going to return it. Not because it's good, but because you make this choice, you live with this choice. And by the way, everything is happening on different levels. Look, for example, at dating apps. You have incredible opportunities to the extent that you cannot make a choice. You're becoming totally frustrated. Now there is a social studies on this. I'm sure that some people probably found happiness there. But all these things that we are perceiving as liberating us is the way that frustrates us. Mm-hmm. And in my view, this is the biggest problem of the current crisis of liberalism. You cannot say, this is our failure, this is our success. We're going to basically defend success and attack failures, because the idea of choice was so important, but choice was weaponized against the happiness of the individual. And in a certain way, when you said that you are not happy with the people, listen, you're not happy with the people, but on the other side, liberalism is about that people are not in the business of making you happy. They have their own choices, they have their own things. If you want to live in a liberal democracy, you should live with this. And Churchill famously said that the strongest argument against democracy is a 10-minute conversation with the ordinary voter. So this is not something that basically we discovered today. And in my view, this is important in my understanding. Liberalism, its success and its kind of a failures is the same thing. And this makes this moment so difficult to explain.
But
please,
I'm sorry.
Can I, I want to in part respond to you, Leon. I understand the argument, and I used to think it was sufficient that, well, these problems aren't liberalism's problem, because we simply set up the structure, we make sure that there are certain rules of the road, and then you're on your own. The problem with that is that, and then you rightly say that if you're having trouble finding meaning in life, well, there are things out there and opportunities for you to find meaning in your life. But if people are not finding it, and they're feeling dissatisfied with the non-political aspects of their lives, and they get it in their heads that their problem is liberalism, then it is liberalism's problem, right? And in order to protect itself, it does have to pay attention to these other aspects of life and respect them so that it doesn't undo them. And then once they're undone, I'm not sure what one does about that as our situation is currently, but we can't not think about this and try to do some healing in this regard, if only to protect the things that we in a more minimal sense care about.
I think the worst thing you could do for a person experiencing existential desolation of some kind is to tell them to look to politics. That is,
but what happens when it happens?
Wait, hold on. We have to identify the problem correctly. In the States, we like to talk about polarization all the time. Problem is not polarization. Our system was designed for that. The problem is wild over-politicization. All of life has been politicized. Everything. And people will discover, if they haven't already, that politics is going to not just disappoint them. There's only one thing worse than ordinary disappointment, and that is eschatological disappointment, which is why the Jews have never accepted a Messiah. We'd rather keep waiting because we know what the alternative is. If they turn to politics, sorry, I forgot. Yes. Oh, damn. How old did you say you were? No. I think that what you were talking about, and Ian was, and Mark too, you weren't talking about liberalism. You were talking about secularization and materialism.
About liberal society.
About materialism. In other words, I don't think that a liberal society has to be remotely as materialistic as our society is. I think that our society confers a cultural and a prestige upon the market and upon shopping, upon material goods that is insane, and that is not an inevitability in a liberal order. That in a liberal order, when you raise children in a liberal order, you face all kinds of challenges, and you can teach them that shopping is not the highest spiritual expression there is. And what happens is that everybody wants to blame this, not just on liberalism. My view is it's not even liberalism that they should forsake in some way, it's politics. We have decimated the non-materialistic, spiritual, religious, cultural, you call it whatever you want, and I'm talking at all levels for all people. I'm not talking just about people who love Debussy. I'm really not. I mean, people find, what some people find in Debussy, other people find in Bruce Springsteen. And it's equally legitimate from the standpoint of their psychological well-being and their spiritual aspirations and so on. So this stereotype that even secularism, there is a hard secularism, which was the Voltairean kind of secularism, according to which you have to banish religion from the public square because there is no God. It's all a big lie. And then there is the softer secularism that says you should beware of the influence of established religion, whether or not it is a lie. It doesn't matter. The truth of religion has no bearing on it, because that's not a political question. And so I think that's what I think. And let me just say one more thing. There's one other word that needs to be mentioned here, and that is the word nationalism. And one of the things we know from the history of nationalism is that there has been liberal nationalism and illiberal nationalism. Right now in our intellectual and political world, you are either a liberal or a nationalist, and all nationalists are called ethno-nationalists. And that is simply neither philosophically nor politically the case. It is possible for liberalism to live with and support and nurture all kinds of feelings of belonging and rootedness. It is not a doctrine of alienation. And again, one of the cliches about liberalism is this strange hatred of individualism, which I have to confess I have never understood, because individualism, attaining to your own personhood, can be a huge spiritual triumph. It really can. Individualism is not just monads looking for love in all the wrong places. So I think that the whole discussion of liberalism and the meaning of life has to be extended and enlarged so that all of these other factors that are real in human lives, have to be included in this. Because the authoritarians, they are getting away with murder on this question. They are persuading lots of people. I mean, what is populism? Populism is a mythology according to which there is a mythological person called the leader, and the leader is mystically in communion with the second mythological entity, which is the people. And of course, we know better. We know that the people for populists is just that part of the population that agrees with these people. That's what the people is. So I think all of these spiritual and religious and national and, all of this, it has to be, the discussion has to be widened out to this. I'm sorry for going on.
There's another form of nationalism, though. That there is the two nationalisms that you mentioned, but Arthur Koestler always said there is nationalism and there is football nationalism.
Right.
And it's not an entirely trivial comment.
No,
because most of us, most human beings, have inside us some craving to be with other people of your own tribe, waving flags, flinging up your arms, screaming, beating up your enemies, and so on. That's why I'm entirely in favor of football nationalism. And this is not, as you say, it's not exactly, it's not what political parties should be engaged in.
That's right.
But so Bolsonaro in his Brazil shirt is an abomination. But I think it's actually very important to have those kind of outlets. To take care of these
identities.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you've seen this exercise is a proof that there's something
Arriba Mexico.
Great in liberalism, because we agree and
Arriba
disagree
Mexico,
and we discuss. I think this is a good way to teach in practice how to listen, how to disagree, and how to agree. Now, we are all here, people that are mainly readers and writers and editors. So I want to start by asking Mark. You have written about authors like Lenin, the so-called post-liberals. What surprised you about them when you read them? What are the main ideas of these people, the ones you wrote about? Should we read them, as Isaiah Berlin used to say, we should read the enemies of liberty in order to understand them and to debate with them better?
Yeah, but also with Isaiah Berlin, he had this acute sense, as he once put it, of, this comes from some English poem, of the frog that gets plowed by a plow in a field, that we have to, take our hat off for a moment for the frog as well, right? And what he meant by that was that there are going to be losses to living in a liberal world. And we have to recognize that the critics of liberalism have understood some of these things in a way that liberals themselves can be blind to. And the problem is that they then take, and this is what we've been talking about up here, is that they take this, what's missing, this missing supplement to liberalism, as itself the kind of font of life that needs to be restored and regenerated to regenerate the nation or a people and overthrow the shackles or the insufficiencies of liberalism. And so the so-called post-liberals in the United States, the term is mainly applied to kind of neo-Catholic movement of intellectuals, some of whom are quite earnest Catholics and have a Catholic critique of what they see as the thinness of liberalism, its undermining of the family, the harmful individualism, some of the things we've spoken about up here. And some of them are political reactionaries for whom religion is important. And that is a class of person who can be very dangerous. Because for them, religion is instrumental, right? And so it is by means of a re-emphasis on religion or an emphasis on certain policies that they want to wrap in a priest's robes. And so it's a group of people who have a mix of motives. Now, one thing about them, and this I suppose brings me back to what I keep, the drum I keep beating, is that I see a number of my students and turning to these people and turning to Catholicism. That in Western Europe, in the United States, I don't know what's the case here in Latin America, but over the past few years, baptisms and conversions have been rising among young people. I went with a group of my conservative students to a Latin Mass in New York a while ago. It's been a long time since I was an altar boy in a Latin Mass. And now the current Pope has made that licit again and legal, but when we went a few months ago, it was not. And it was packed, half the audience with old Latino ladies and half with these young conservatives. And I meet them and I talk to them. One of them has just given up the idea of going to graduate school. He's now entered a seminary in New Orleans where he grew up. He wants to be a parish priest in a poor neighborhood. They're seeking sustenance, spiritual sustenance. But they have heard the clarion call of these people who want to exploit that impulse and that desire for these other political ends. And so my job as a teacher is to try to pull them apart from these things and have them look at them as separate. So there's something in it that is kind of classic in terms of the intellectual enemies of liberalism. And in part, there's something else going on, right? And that deserves at least some minimal respect, but certainly some concern that doesn't turn bad. But that means engaging with these people, reading these people, and meeting them on their terrain.
Mm-hmm. Ian, we have been talking about religion. Religion is an unexpected or expected word here, a ghost. And you've written books that dwell on, that touch the subject of tolerance, of, you are Dutch, you have written on intolerance in Amsterdam, and you've also wrote about the woke movement, and you've seen some religious component in wokeism, and you've written recently a book on Spinoza, tolerance, intolerance, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, so the relation between the sacred and the profane. Tell us your thoughts about
That's such a big question.
about these 3 books in 3 minutes.
I can't do that.
Go on. So you have 30 minutes.
Well, first of all, to speak for myself, I have to make a confession. On my mother's side, I come from assimilated, unreligious Jews. On my father's side, lapsed Christians. And the only thing, Protestants, and the only thing I've sort of inherited, apart from a love of Wagner from my Jewish family, is a slight prejudice against Catholics.
So why don't you make a dialogue between your two parts?
But that's by the by. Again, it comes back to this thing of, as a liberal, and especially as a secular liberal, how do you deal with these religious yearnings, which are real? And I entirely agree with Mark that you have to take it seriously. What I've written about, and what concerns me often, is the ways in which religious yearnings go sour or find the wrong objects. And I think we haven't really talked about that very much so far in this conference. We've talked about why people have turned to populism and the resentments and the anger and so on and so forth. But one aspect of Trump and what makes him different from, I think, J.D. Vance or other politicians is that he is the object of a real cult. When you look at a Trump rally, it's like watching a revivalist American prayer meeting. People, the way that the people look at him, the way they dress, their gestures are a mixture, but that's a very American phenomenon, a mixture of showbiz and religious revival. And they worship him, they believe in him, which has nothing to do with policies or things that are promised or economics or anything. They found him as a religious target or a religious object for those yearnings. And I felt the same in my analysis of woke at the time. And it's slightly, I don't think my analysis is out of date, but I think concentrating too much on woke now is probably past its date, because right-wing intolerance is much more dangerous, I believe, right now than woke is. But my analysis of it was that I saw it again as a form of American Puritanism. And this goes back to my own native country, where Protestantism in the 17th century, in Spinoza's time, but later too, was very much in the vein of, if you get rich, you are favored by God. That was the Calvinist. That was the Calvinist thing. Yeah. And also the way you showed your status, your social status, was not the aristocratic way of bloodlines and ostentatious living and taste and so on. It was virtue, a superior virtue. So if you look at Franz Hals' paintings of sort of people in the boards of orphanages and so on, these are virtuous people. And their faces express virtue. And that was very much for them a religious idea. And I saw in American wokery in universities, publishers, the sort of elite artistic and academic and intellectual world of the United States, very much a form of that kind of, quasi-Calvinist, Puritan status seeking. So status seeking through demonstrations of virtue.
Leon, what do you think about that religious substratum of these movements?
I think that I don't think we should be afraid of religion. I have always thought that the combustion of religion and politics or religion and nationalism is almost always a very dangerous phenomenon. And that the single darkest day in the history of Western religion and politics was the day that Constantine accepted Christianity. I mean, that really was a big damn mistake. But I think that, you know, liberalism obviously arose in part as a response to the wars of religion in Europe, which nobody wanted to see again. And until the 20th century, it was possible to equate anti-liberalism or religion with war and atrocity and murder. After the 20th century, after the totalitarian enormities, that identification was not so simple anymore. And I think one of the things one learns, not just from history, but from personal experience, is that there is, and many religious philosophers recognize this, that religion and morality are not the same thing. And that there are evil believers and evil unbelievers, and virtuous believers and virtuous unbelievers. So I'm not so afraid when Mark talks about the rising rate of baptisms. That doesn't scare me that much. I'm glad you're there to challenge these students. There's no question about that. And there's no question that the religiosity can be politically exploited and manipulated. I mean, it's a nightmare waiting to happen. But it doesn't frighten me because I need to know more about the individuals who are baptizing their babies. I mean, they're either good people or bad people. I think that obviously religion after secularism is much more preferable than religion before secularism because people can now believe in whatever they want and they can now live non-religious lives as well. And this is a real revolution. People, you know, the standard cliche, I'm sure Ian found this when he was doing his work on Spinoza, is that Spinoza was the first neutral individual who you know, left Judaism but didn't convert to Christianity.
Well, he was kicked out.
Well, yes, yeah, well, but anyway, who was...
Let's not get there.
No, just... they had their reasons.
Well, he left, absolutely.
They had their reasons.
He said they did to him what he should have done himself.
Well, there you go, exactly. That's exactly right. So I think that I have always approached all my religious Christian friends, conservatives, even some Trumpists, and asked them a very simple question. I say to them, is there any act of Christian worship or practice that you have been forbidden from performing in this liberal society? And the answer is always no. Always no. So the benefit of liberalism extends to believers as well. And even more than that, it is the believers whom we have to understand experience the frustration of living in this society, because if you believe that you are in the exclusive possession of the truth, as all believing religious people must in some way believe, and then you're told you can believe that, but you can't take it into the street, or you can take it into the street, but you experience a certain amount of frustration, which secular people do not. And so I think that the whole religious secular thing under a liberal order is much more complicated and actually much more gratifying than you would think.
I wanted, tell me if you've touched in this answer of yours, in this intervention. I was going to ask you, you have written in the essays in your magazine Liberties, that you edit with Celeste Marcus, Liberties, your magazine, that you've been reading the French philosophers of the 17th century very much. What is that you are finding in them? an escape, or what kind of teaching?
No, I find a better weather. What I mean is that I used to have arguments with Richard Rorty, who lived nearby, all the time about this. And I have not given up on metaphysics. I do not believe that, I mean, if you asked me what I believe theologically, I'd have a hard time telling you. But one thing I can say for sure, I do not believe that the entirety of human life, and maybe even the entirety of natural life, when we get to the problem of the origins of consciousness, can be explained in purely materialistic terms. Once you believe that, you're on the same side of the line as mystics, logicians, mathematicians, believers. You know, there's a whole... I wrote that essay on Malebranche, and I read these philosophers because I think that the questions they're asking and the realm in which they're asking them is still relevant, and that no historical change can retire metaphysics, that the question of the relationship of philosophical principle to historical circumstances is very complicated, And I don't think that metaphysics died on July 14, 1789. I just don't believe it, because I don't think that anything that happened in Paris on July 14, 1789 had the power to destroy metaphysics. It was about something else. So I find it increasingly as I get older, even though in political writing, as you know, you have to repeat yourself. You cannot say it once and expect to have any impact. So in political writing, you have to be tiresome if you're going to have any influence. And so I find that I'm now in the mood and have done less overtly political writing because, you know, there isn't a lot of time left, and I would like to spend more time in that realm, not because I'm going to find the answer, but I enjoy the damn questions.
You should read more Maupassant. The only thing that gives real meaning to life is lots of sex.
I don't agree with that, despite the fact...
I kind of agree with it.
Well, no. Let me put it to you this way. I think we can both say that we're drawing opposite conclusions from the same empirical experience. No, I'm afraid...
Honor is saved.
Let's stay in the 17th century for a moment, because
Sure.
what does Spinoza has to say for the 21st century? You wrote a book on him.
Well, I've been criticized for saying this, but I still believe it. In Spinoza's time, the great conflict in politics, in universities and elsewhere, was between the Calvinist established orthodox preachers and the so-called philosophers, who were really scientists, who believed that human reason was the way to finding the truth. And like today, this was not just an ideological struggle, it was a struggle for authority, jobs, political power, and so on and so forth. And his conclusion about the way to solve these problems in the university specifically was not to say science or philosophy, it was then called, is superior to finding the truth through God's word. You just keep them apart. You can have respect for the metaphysical idea, but don't confuse them. And I think we can use that lesson today, that when people talk about, I am any gender I choose to be, okay, people should be free to do that. You should respect their decisions, but don't confuse it with biology. And I know that this
Don't confuse it
with biology.
Yep.
And I know that this is a controversy. You know, many people get very angry when they hear you say such a thing, and so I've been very much criticized for using Spinoza to make this point, but I stand by it.
Ivan, I want to touch one subject that that has to do with something that you've experienced very closely: migration and our subject, liberalism, tolerance, intolerance in Europe. This is migration, Islamic migration, what's happening in Germany, in France, in Belgium, in England. For us in Mexico is something a bit far, but for you is something that's close by. So,
no, listen. At the end of the day, all this is identity buildings. Imagine the map of Europe in the year 1900, and this map should be a cultural, religious map. And you're going to see two Europes. One was much more ethnically and religiously homogeneous, and this was Western Europe, Germany, France. And the other was extremely culturally diverse, religiously diverse, ethnically diverse, and this was Eastern Europe. This was Habsburg Empire, this was the Ottomans. The whole 20th century, when people were saying people are always moving, this is true, but in 20th century, as a result of World War II, two wars and one revolution, people have been moving, producing more homogeneous societies. Suddenly, this very kind of a diverse Eastern Europe became very much ethnically homogeneous. In 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland were not ethnic Poles. There was Jews, there were Germans, there were Ukrainians. In 1989, 95% of basically the population of Poland have been ethnic Poles. And don't blame Poles for this. This was done on them. And as a result of it, ethnic homogeneity became the way East European societies very much legitimized their states. Diversity was perceived as a security threat. And keep in mind, the most democratic societies in the mid-1930s, after the end of the World War II, were the first to insist on the expulsion of the minorities. It was Czechoslovakia. It was President Beneš who went to the great powers and said, Czechoslovakia was a liberal democracy. We treated German minority right, and they betrayed us. So they should go back to Germany. So for the whole 20th century, for East Europeans, any type of diversity was perceived as a threat. Security, cultural, political. This is how the identity of these countries have been built. And by the way, we always talk about the problem of colonial states. Being anti-colonial and anti-imperial also has its legacies. For example, East European states were not very strong on universalist story. We were suspicious when the Pope was trying to speak on behalf of universalism. Communism was a universalist discourse and so on. So then imagine what happened in 1989, because the major stories after the World War I came President Wilson and said, let's change the borders so you're going to have a much more homogeneous societies. After 1945, the idea was, okay, we're not going so much to touch the borders, but we're going to exchange populations. And after 1989, the idea was we're not going to touch borders unless you have the disintegration of states like Yugoslavia and Soviet Union, but we're going to change the nature of the borders. And people start moving. And listen, in Eastern Europe, moving means that people start living. Bulgaria is the country in the world that has suffered the fastest demographic shrinking of the population in the absence of war or natural disaster. In year 1989, 9 million people have been living in Bulgaria. Now it's less than 7.5 million. And why I'm telling you, one of the words which was never basically mentioned was demography. But you're never going to understand what is happening on the right if you're not going to understand the demographic anxiety. Society without children, society basically which are shrinking. At the same time, when you ask East Europeans what is the best thing that happened to us, they're going to say opening of the borders. What is the thing that threatens you most? Opening of the borders. Put yourself in the position of my mother. On one level, we can travel. We have better life, for sure. She benefited from this, but neither her son nor her grandchildren are near her. As one old lady told me, she said, Ivan, European Union is okay, but it took our kids and our doctors. So from this point of view, you have this kind of an anxiety where, again, I'm saying the good and the bad is the same thing. And of course, East European societies will start to diverge. And there are going to be much more people moving. And in a certain way, many East Europeans are living there. By the way, talking about migration, the president of Mexico has a Bulgarian origin. The former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, has a Bulgarian father. So people have been moving all the time. But for societies, it means an identity change. You should try to basically relearn everything that you have learned in the 20th century. And it should happen very tough. And it should happen very fast. And as a result of it, we end up, in my view, and this is very interesting for me, and this was always something that was very important for my understanding of current politics, is you have two apocalyptic imagination in European politics these days. On the left, it's much more coming from climate change. You have basically the fear of the young people that if we continue going like this, they're not going to be life in the world. So they're the last man, but not in the sense of Frank Fukuyama, but the last human. On the right, this is the demographic anxiety. I'm the last Bulgarian. In 100 years, nobody is going to speak Bulgarian. Why I'm going to write all these kind of things which they are not going to be readers. And as a result of it, what is changing? When you have these two kind of apocalyptic imagination, they're changing the nature of democracy. Democracy is about open future. Democracy is about the art of postponing. I can solve this problem today, but other problems I'm going to solve tomorrow. If you believe that you do not have time, that if on these elections you're not going to win, tomorrow what you're going to decide doesn't matter, democracy cannot work. Democracy cannot work, in my view, in two conditions. When the stakes are too low, regardless of what you're voting, you're getting the same, or when they're too high. And I do believe this is part of the crisis that we see. And this is very much changing the story. And this is why migration in Eastern Europe, because this was the paradox of Eastern Europe, strong anti-migration sentiment in the absence of migrants. Nobody's really now excited to come to Bulgaria or Hungary if you can go to Germany or France. But suddenly, this fear that my community is going to disappear, what I'm doing, is creating this strange type of a populism. And when you're talking about fanaticism and so on, at least the populism that I see is very different. It's kind of a totally defensive. By the way, the European far right adopted the language of the anti-colonial movements of the 1960s. Now we're the indigenous people. We're the Mayans, the Aztecas of this land. Don't come and destroy us. And this is a kind of an interesting political turn.
Can I ask Ivan a question?
Yes.
Given the fact, I think we can all agree that the old fantasy, the classical nationalist fantasy, that the political, religious, and ethnic boundaries of a nation state would perfectly coincide, because they never do, right, ever. And now, and in the light of the recent Muslim migrations, do you think there is any way that various European nation states could one day come to define the nation in their nation state multi-ethnically? Is that at all possible, or?
Listen, I do believe it's possible, but also it's interesting to look at the American history to try to see how this is going to happen. And honestly speaking, this is not going to be very nice too. Because we like to talk about, for example, the race discourse, and to talk about the whites. The white was a category which does not exist in the European discourse. By the way, in English, race and nations have been synonymous.
Yeah.
And then you have all these Bulgarians, Italians coming, and you try to integrate these different ethnic differences, and all they ended up being white. By the way, different ethnic group ended white in a different period. For Bulgarians, for Jews, for the Irish, it came much later. But this was inclusive, but in order to make it inclusive, you should exclude somebody else. And come white-black type of a racial story, which in the United States has a story. I'm afraid that part of the anti-immigration discourse is very interesting, because suddenly we're against the people who are coming, but we are not against, for example, the Muslims who are already here. 10% of the Bulgarian population are Bulgarian Turks. The relations towards the Bulgarian Turks was totally normalized. And you should keep in mind, in 1989, Bulgarian Communist State expelled 300,000 Turks from the country because we decided there are too many of them. So now the Turks are not the problem. The Turks are Bulgarians. But we are afraid of Syrians coming, of others, and so on. So in a certain way, any type of inclusion and multiculturalism is not going to be openness to others immediately. It's always going to be selectively integrating some and confronting others. And particularly for East European countries, it's very difficult also to internalize European guilt. So we all are cosmopolitans, but we are born in certain places. My joke is always that in Europe we have a common dreams, but our nightmares are strictly national. So for Bulgaria, who was for 500 years under the Ottoman rule, to feel as a colonizer is not easy.
Can I say one thing in response to Leon's question?
And also, if you want to talk about
well, no, I mean there is one anecdotal example of why there is perhaps room for some optimism here, which again has to do with football. Club sides and national sides in Europe used to be completely tribal. You had Catholic clubs, you had Jewish clubs, you had clubs that were parts of certain cities and against other parts of cities. National sides, you know, were truly national, where they were all white and native and so on. Now, the average club in the British English Premier League has 2 English football players, foreign coaches. The average national side now is 70% people with an immigrant background, usually black. The enthusiasm of the supporters has not changed at all.
Yeah.
And I think that is some room for optimism.
Yes,
So all we have
football
to
will save us.
Football will save
but
us.
all we have to worry about are the non-athletic sectors of society.
Yeah, well,
In one thing, Orwell got it wrong. He wrote a piece against nationalism in sport.
Yes.
But, well, the man got it right in so many things. I have a few quick things to ask about books, and then my general fast remark, and we're done. Mark, your last book, you talk about, and it will appear in Spanish very soon, on ignorance. And you have this idea that ignorance can be not only useful, but also a path to some kind of happiness, no? Or some kind of and you say that we like to know things, but we also prefer not to know things. Can you elaborate a bit?
Yeah, so the book will be out in April. On Amazon, they take Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and your bank card. I was interested in a sense, the power of ignorance. At a certain point in Daniel Deronda, George Eliot talks about, says something like, everyone talks about the power of knowledge, but who is really considered the power of ignorance? And how can ignorance be a power? Well, ignorance, one way of defining ignorance is a lack of knowledge, so it's a lack, it's not a power. But what I write about is, following more Nietzsche, is who I think was right on this, that our minds are have parts that are at war with each other, to speak metaphorically, that there's a will to knowledge that we have, a curiosity, and there's a will to ignorance, a desire to shut the window, to close your ears, to say, don't tell me how the movie ends. You don't want to know, right? And I think those are basic and irreducible. You can't reduce one to the other. And once the issue is framed like that, I was interested in developing a kind of balance sheet. On the one hand, I mean, there are ways in which there are things that we don't want to know, and for perfectly benign reasons. We don't want to know the day of our deaths, for example. Sometimes we foolishly look for information when we shouldn't. If you're a trapeze artist, you shouldn't be Googling how long trapeze artists live before you climb up the pole. But that's all benign, and we like surprise parties and things like that. But there's something deeper. There are many things deeper, I think, where we have a resistance to knowing that begins in our resistance to knowing ourselves. That the story of Oedipus is our story, not just in sexual terms, that's the least significant way, I think, but here is a man who is torn between the will to know and not know what's true about himself, which is the fact that he has married his mother and killed his father. Going from that point, there are ways in which we don't want to know, or we develop fantasies of how maintaining our ignorance might help us. And we believe there are alternative paths to knowledge. Whenever I hear something like that, you hear that a lot in the university, alternative knowledges, which is meaningless. There's knowledge and there's not knowledge. But we think that we can have a mystical insight or something like that, where we can somehow do an end run around the need to gather empirical evidence and reason about it. Another example is political nostalgia. If the present feels overwhelming and you don't want to face the problems of the present, one way of reacting is to imagine some glorious past and see the political challenge of the time to be either going back to that past or using the past as an inspiration for a futuristic, non-liberal state. And so I simply worked through the psychology of this, and the book came out 1 week after Trump was elected, which was actually a coincidence because I'd been working on it for a couple of decades, but a lot of the questions were, well, how does this play out in American politics? And my answer always was, you know the answer to that question.
Okay. Leon, you've been an editor all your life. You were the editor of the New Republic of I don't know how many decades.
About 150 years.
And then you are now the editor of Liberties. Irving Howe, our friend, your friend, used to say that when intellectuals are in despair and have nothing else to look for, they found a magazine.
They start a journal, yes.
And so tell us about, in which way do you think Liberties, or a literary intellectual magazine, contributes to the debate that we have been, that is the motive of this conference?
The journal was founded during COVID to be in some deep way countercultural. And what I mean, a few things. One, it is, like other journals, a journal with causes. I've always believed in causes and not just ideas. And its two main causes are the rehabilitation of liberalism and the rehabilitation of the humanities, which are in profound crisis at all levels of the educational spectrum. Those were the causes. The idea was that there would be no, and I'm speaking the American vernacular here, there would be no hot takes, rapid responses, chyrons. You know, no matter how long Trump is in the White House, the words Susie Wiles will never appear in Liberties. She's Trump's chief of staff. We were designed to pull away from breaking news, upon which the American population, owing in part to the technology, is choking to death, and to try to deal with larger questions that are behind the news and behind the noise. in order to do this, we decided that we would publish real and long essays. I mean, you know, the shortest piece we've ever published is 3,800 words. The longest piece is 24,000 words, I think. But we were going to let writers and thinkers have all the space they need to develop their ideas. And if anything, what they get from myself and Celeste when they send us pieces is, it's terrific, but could you add this and that? And so we were trying to restore a certain ideal of prose discourse, a certain ideal of polemical discourse, and we were trying to desynchronize the discussion of culture from the discussion of politics. They are almost always synchronized, and that is the road to hell intellectually, or Sobella once spoke of the good intentions paving company. And that is, you know, to desynchronize that, we decided we would have writers from around the world because the crises that many countries are facing are astonishingly similar, even though there are important national differences. And each issue is about 300 pages. And it comes out 4 times a year, so you have 3 months to eat your spinach, and then there will be another big fat book. But again, the idea was, you know, I've believed for a long time that there are only 2 revolutionary acts that are still possible: to slow anything down and to make anything smaller. And here we decided to try to slow things down a little, so that larger arguments can be made, and not just about electoral choices, about worldviews, about belief systems, about, you know, and it's, you know, most people have a worldview and they don't know what it is. Some people have a worldview and they do know what it is, but they couldn't tell you what its reasons are. So, you know, if you put a gun to the head of the average American at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, are you for Trump or against Trump? They could tell you right away. If you said, what is democracy? Forget it. Forget it. So the idea was that there would be some address, some sanctuary for people who wanted to write and think at length about first principles and their relationship to social and political realities. That was the idea, and I have to say, so far, it's doing quite well. I'm certainly very, very proud of what it is. I mean, we are right, I mean, well, everybody here, you're next, Ivan, but everybody here is written for liberties, and it's thinking about the long term of intellectual life in America. I mean, you know, it's moving too fast. Everybody asks you to write 800 words. If you have a colorful adjective or adverb, they ask you to please remove it. And if you have, God forbid, a heterodox political orientation, it's trouble. Now, we've published some conservatives and we've published some progressives, because what we mean by liberalism is the liberal order in the larger sense. In the larger sense. And there are certain arguments that take place among liberals and between liberals. The answers to all the questions are not easy. In fact, you know, again, I spoke earlier about the package. We are deeply anti-package. Deeply anti. You know, you mentioned Dan Bell before. It was his teaching that human life is lived in a variety of realms, and each of the realms have their own, you know, methods and temporalities, and the biggest mistake you could do is to give an economic answer to a cultural question or a cultural answer to a political question. I mean, you can develop things, but the idea was to honor the full complexity and the lack of a totality. Thank you.
The word cosmopolitan has been used in many ways. I have a good opinion of the word cosmopolitan. And if there is one writer who has not only written about so many parts of the world, but has actually lived there and experienced there, not as a tourist, but actually living for years and being immersed and being a writer and an editor in different parts of the world, that's Jan Buruma. That's one of his unique aspects. Tell us, I have two questions for you. One is the East. The East. I mean, Japan, you've studied Japan, particularly Japan. Borges went there once and said, I am deeply humbled. I have only admiration for this very superior civilization. You've written, you've lived, you have been married, you have your children also from Japan. Can you tell us, this is on a question that I'm sure was not in the mind of the public, but it was in my mind because I know you, and it's important in your life and in your work.
What is the question exactly?
Tell us about how it has enriched your life and how the knowledge of that civilization would make people more conscious of what Borges said and knew.
I'm not sure I have such high-minded views of it. I mean, I grew up in a mixed national and non-religious, but mixed ethnic household. So I was, from the moment I was born, I felt there was part of at least two countries, Britain and the Netherlands. That gives you a certain perspective on things, which is that you never take things for granted. You're never an insider. You're sort of an insider and an outsider. You're always looking at things from an angle. And that certainly gave me the curiosity to look at other cultures, and not only the curiosity, but also the desire always to be somewhere else, which can be a strength and a weakness. The reason I got interested in Japan, and first in China, is partly because I didn't know what else to do, and this was the very early 70s, and I spent some time in London, and I met Indians and lit sort of joss sticks and listened to Ravi Shankar and smoked hash and thought, there's a whole part of the world that I know nothing about, and it seems rather attractive. And I thought, well, I should study maybe one of those exotic places, something that is useful. And Sanskrit didn't quite fit that bill, so I thought, well, I like Chinese food, so why not? And I thought Chinese women were rather attractive, so I thought, well, maybe Chinese. And I think this is actually important. I cannot imagine studying another culture without a certain sensual aspect of it. You can't study it as an abstraction. And studying China at the time was studying an abstraction. You couldn't go there unless you were part of the official Friends of the People group, and people looked unattractive. I didn't like reading China reconstructs about bumper harvests and so on and so forth. Mao's China was like studying the other side of the moon. It didn't interest me. And then I saw Japanese movies and Japanese theater, and I felt like the kid in the village seeing the circus in town and wanting to go with the circus. And one of the main reason was that under that, I very quickly understood this, sitting in the Cinémathèque in Paris or in London at the Pullman Theatre, watching these Japanese films, that even though I then didn't understand a word of the language, it was a world that was then completely strange to me, that underneath that strangeness was a deep common humanity. And here I'm with Leon. I think it's very important to keep universalism, to honor it. And it was the common humanity that really attracted me. And I've lived I mean, this is what stops me from being a truly rootless cosmopolitan, because yes, I'm cosmopolitan in the sense that I've lived in Hong Kong and in Japan and in New York and in Berlin and many other places, and I like speaking foreign languages, and I speak Japanese at home and so on and so forth. But I'm not rootless because I've always been very aware that underneath all those differences, we have so much in common. And it's what people miss who talk about the East and the West, and I went to Japan and it was totally weird and so on. It's not weird if as soon as you speak a language, it stops being particularly weird, and if you look a little more carefully, no place is weird.
Well, I would like to end then with a quote, and I think maybe I'm wrong, but maybe it's from Las Casas, Bartolomé de las Casas, quoted by Luis Hanke, one of the great American historiographers about Mexico. Humanity is one. So we have arrived to a consensus. We have to believe in those human values, try to understand them, and maybe even to convey them or to teach them. Thank you so much for this, for me unforgettable.
Thank you. Very well moderated. Very well moderated.
I didn't have the question,
No, it was
but you
good.
have the answer.
No, it was good.
Muchas gracias a Lion.
That was a wonderful answer.
Jan Boruma, Enrique Krauze, Iván Krasep y Mark Lila por su participación. Los invitamos mañana a las 4 de la tarde. Los invitamos mañana a las 4 de la tarde a la mesa La amenaza autoritaria, en la cual participarán José Ramón Cossío, José María Lassalle y Celeste Marcus. Moderará León Krauze. Muchas gracias a todos por haber venido, a quienes nos siguen desde las redes sociales y al equipo del Colegio Nacional por su eficacia y solidaridad. Buenas noches.